We've been doing this show now for about 3 years, and I've used my father-in-law as an example and really our experience in providing care for him. At first, we provided care for him. We were in California. He was in Pennsylvania. And I was talking about care at a distance and just how hard it was and how technology could really fill that gap. And that was the experience early on. Well, eventually he moved in with us in Southern California, and we became the primary care provider. And it was a different experience at that point. Well, my wife's father passed away 2 weeks ago from what was essentially complications from COPD and CHF. And I wanted to give a little tribute to him. He has been a part of the show, and I've shared his experience. We shared his experience with going to the ED, the medical record not transferring. And since we've talked about him so much, I thought I'd give you guys a little very short tribute to him. He really was a wonderful man. Just give you a little perspective here. He left the military to care for his family once his father became ill. His father later died in his arms. To give you an idea of how much of a caring person this guy was, he cared for his son who was born with brain damage and never learned to walk or talk, never really progressed past an infant mindset. But he cared for him in the home for 44 years until he died, and all that entailed. We used to joke, he was the executor of so many wills of the people who lived around him. And part of that was he was such a trustworthy person. He said what he meant, and he did what he said. He lived pretty much by routine. He was a bookkeeper by trade, so he was very methodical. In fact, when he would come out and visit early on in our marriage, we'd go out for dinner, and I would do everything I could to try to pay the bill, and I would leave the table, I'd pay it and whatever. And invariably a week later, we'd get an itemized checklist of all the things that he felt like they should have paid for with a check in it. Just to give you an idea of his bookkeeper mindset. He lived by routine. Price is right. Let's make a deal. Sit out in the sun. Happy hour was every day at 4 o'clock. Dinner and a game of gin every night, Wheel of Fortune, Jeopardy, and then a good Clint Eastwood movie would round out his day. And that pretty much described a lot of his days. That's what he was doing the last couple of years he was with us. In his final days, he could only get a few words out. And I think this says a lot about who somebody is. And the few words he could get out, all of them were, "I love you," to his daughter. And a friend of mine once said to me that when you get squeezed by life, you get to see what's really inside of a person. And in his dying days, we got to see what was inside of him. He loved us well, and we will miss him. Just to tie this in a little bit, here's what we learned about healthcare in his final years, but really in his final days. I already shared about the medical record movement. It was challenging going from Pennsylvania to Southern California, but then Southern California to Florida was not as challenging, mostly because we knew what to tell them to do in order to get the medical record. So we were really telling them, not something that everybody's going to have the advantage of, the knowledge of how the EHR works and how interoperability works, how to get the records from one place to another. And it's really a shame, but it's still the case that you have to help the health systems to provide the best care for you. It's not wired. It's not synced up yet. Finding doctors is hard when you move to a new location. That's one of the things we found. We moved him a couple times, and getting that right mix of doctors is challenging. And the information is not that great. We're still doing it by word of mouth for the most part. Choosing insurance is really hard without a coach. If you think about this, a child trying to care for an aging parent, coaches, and you're really looking for a coach who isn't connected with the insurance company. And when you find them, they're invaluable. And we did find a woman who walked us through all the different options, what to consider, what was paid for, what wasn't, which was really helpful. Technology was not really helpful in caring for him. And perhaps that's a little over the top, to be honest with you. His care was coordinated well. That was obvious. And many care providers he saw were informed. So the information was flowing from one care provider to another. But outside of that, there were a ton of phone calls, a ton of faxes and papers flying all around, almost no online scheduling, and even texting was not something that the doctor's office wanted to partake in. His home care nurse was exceptional, and it was a great program. once a week in the house. She also acted as the quarterback for the care team, and it was really effective. I mean, she would come in and say, what's your next doctor? Well, that's not the next doctor you should see. You should see this one. And then she would make the phone calls and change the appointments for us and do all that stuff. That was a really good program. If your health system is doing that, and I'd put some money behind that, that's very, very effective, great experience from our perspective. It's interesting because we talk about experience a lot, right? And the experience is interesting. So same hospital, same course of 2 weeks. His care in the ICU was phenomenal, as you would expect. It's expensive. There's a lot of nurses. The patient per care provider is pretty, the ratio is the right ratio. And on the 4th floor, exceptional care. I mean, the nurse was constantly coming in. She was kind and those kind of things. On the 2nd floor, you couldn't find anybody. It's just interesting. Like, nobody would come into the room. His food would sit there. He needed to be fed towards the end, and he wasn't fed, and those kind of things. We'd have to go out and find somebody. So it wasn't uniform around the hospital. And so we could do all sorts of things around the experience, all sorts of things around the technology. But at the end of the day, if we can't figure out what Disney has figured out and what others in Southwest has figured out and what others have figured out in terms of keeping our staff motivated, keeping them valued and trained on doing the right things, and then measuring those things, we're still going to fall down in certain areas. I will say this: frontline caregivers have a tough job. We saw families come in and they were incredibly demanding, and I understand that happens. People are at the lowest point in their lives. It's a very difficult job, and even though you're sitting there going, "Hey, why aren't they coming in?" If you get beat up all week with a bunch of families that are very demanding, I can understand how that could wear on you after a while. On the flip side, there's people who you could tell this is their life calling. They are amazing. They can take that and they take it with a smile and a kind word back and those kind of things. They diffuse those situations really well. They're just heroes is thrown around a little too much in our industry. We used to say all frontline workers are heroes. I believe that they have been in challenging times. All of them have been in challenging times for the last year, for granted, but not all of them really are heroes per se. I mean, yes, they have courage, and yes, they work really hard, but when you know a hero when you see them. It's that person that puts the dying person at ease. It's the doctor who sat with my wife and spent the time. Yeah, I think this was a cardiologist. Actually, I'm sure it was a cardiologist. Spent the time talking to my wife about his family experience and just the empathy that came across, and how he just recently had to bury his mother, and he knew what she was going through, and she was moved. I mean, there's just so many of those stories in our industry. And it's sort of, I get a little concerned that we throw hero around and we say all healthcare workers are heroes, when there are people that really are distinctive in terms of the amazing care, compassion, empathy, skill that they practice with. So anyway, that was amazing. I think it was, they sent a financial person in. One of the things you start to think after a while, you hear all these surprise bill stories and whatnot, you start to wonder, it's like, how much is this going to cost? And they sat down with us and went through everything. And not only, hey, here's what this is going to cost, here's what this is costing you, here's what the insurance is going to cover. It was really well done. Not only that, we found out that his hospice care was going to be covered by Medicare, something we didn't really know. And for that matter, while we're talking about Medicare really is good insurance. We can argue if the country can afford it. We can argue if a single payer system for all really makes sense, but I'm not sure we can argue too much that Medicare is pretty good insurance. It covered a significant amount of his care coming out of this experience. So that took a load off. I appreciate you letting me share this tribute and a little bit of the personal experience. I think we're all going to have this kind of experience, and it helps us to think through from the patient perspective, from the family perspective, how our work is really impacting people.